The old house across the street had been there for as long as anyone in the neighborhood could remember. Its peeling paint, sagging roof, and broken windows were a fixture of the street, a silent monument to neglect. Children whispered stories about it at school, teenagers dared each other to approach it, and adults avoided speaking of it altogether. But everyone, without exception, obeyed one rule: don't look at it when it glows. Claire moved to the neighborhood in late October, just as the leaves had turned golden and the air carried the first hints of winter. She was 27, newly single, and eager for a fresh start. The house she rented was modest but cozy, with a view of the infamous old house directly across the street. The warnings began almost immediately. "You want to keep your blinds closed at night," said Mrs. Goodwin, the elderly woman who lived 2 doors down. Claire had smiled politely. "Why?" Mrs. Goodwin's expression darkened. "Because of that house." She gestured toward the dilapidated structure with a trembling hand. "It glows sometimes, at 2 a.m., like clockwork. Whatever you do, don't look at it." "Is this a Halloween joke?" Claire had laughed, but Mrs. Goodwin didn't join in. "No joke, dear," she said. "Just a warning." Claire didn't take it seriously, of course. She wasn't the superstitious type, and the idea of a glowing house sounded ridiculous. Still, as she unpacked her boxes that first night, she caught herself glancing out the window at the old house more often than she'd like to admit. It loomed in the darkness, its silhouette stark against the pale glow of the streetlights. It didn't look particularly menacing, just an abandoned building. Yet there was something about it that set her teeth on edge. She drew the blinds, telling herself it was to block out the draft. The first night passed uneventfully. Claire fell asleep easily, exhausted from unpacking. She woke the next morning feeling refreshed, the warning from Mrs. Goodwin a distant memory. But as the days turned into weeks, Claire couldn't ignore the whispers from her neighbors. She overheard snippets of conversation at the grocery store. "Did you hear about the Johnson boy? Looked at the house. Hasn't been the same since. I heard the light's not natural. It's alive. People disappear when they get too curious." Curiosity began to gnaw at Claire. The stories were absurd, but they were also intriguing. What could possibly make an old house glow? She considered asking more questions, but hesitated. The neighbors seemed genuinely frightened, and she didn't want to come across as the crazy newcomer obsessed with the haunted house. One night, Claire was up late working on a freelance graphic design project. The clock on her laptop read 1:50 a.m. when she decided to take a break. She wandered into the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and leaned against the counter, staring out the window. The old house stood silent and dark, as it always did. But as the minutes ticked by, something changed. At exactly 2 a.m., a faint glow emanated from the house's windows. It wasn't a natural light, too pale, too steady. It seemed to pulse faintly, like a heartbeat, and it cast strange, shifting shadows across the overgrown yard. Claire's breath caught in her throat. "Don't look at it." Mrs. Goodwin's warning rang in her ears, but Claire couldn't tear her eyes away. She leaned closer to the window, trying to make sense of the light. It was almost hypnotic, drawing her in. And then she saw movement. A shadow passed behind one of the glowing windows, swift and deliberate. Claire's heart pounded. The house was supposed to be abandoned, wasn't it? She grabbed her phone, intending to call the police, but stopped herself. What would she say? That she saw a light and a shadow? They'd dismiss her as paranoid. Instead, she decided to investigate. Claire threw on a jacket and stepped outside, shivering as the cold air bit at her skin. The street was eerily silent, the glow from the old house casting an unnatural light on the pavement. As she approached, the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. The glow was brighter now, spilling through the cracks in the boarded-up windows and illuminating the peeling paint. The air around the house felt thick, almost electric, and there was a faint humming sound, like a swarm of insects just out of sight. Claire reached the edge of the yard and hesitated. The house seemed to pulse, as if it were alive. She could feel its presence, a heavy, oppressive force that pressed against her chest. This is a bad idea, she thought, but her feet carried her forward anyway. She climbed the creaking steps to the front porch and placed a hand on the doorknob. It was ice cold, sending a jolt up her arm. She turned it slowly, the door creaking open to reveal a dark, musty interior. The glow was brighter inside, emanating from an open doorway at the end of the hall. The humming was louder here, a low, rhythmic sound that seemed to vibrate in her bones. "Hello," Claire called out, her voice trembling. No answer. She stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the warped floorboards. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew, but beneath there was another scent, something metallic like blood. The light spilled from the open doorway, casting long shadows that writhed and twisted as if alive. Claire's stomach churned, but she pressed on, her curiosity overpowering her fear. As she reached the doorway, the humming grew deafening. She peered inside, her breath catching in her throat. The room was empty except for a single object in the center, a mirror. It was tall and ornate, its frame carved with strange, intricate symbols. The glowing light came from the mirror itself, its surface rippling like water. Claire felt an overwhelming urge to step closer, to touch the mirror, to look into it. But as she took a step forward, her reflection changed. The woman in the mirror wasn't her. Her reflection grinned, its eyes gleaming with malice. It raised a hand and beckoned her forward. Claire stumbled back, her heart racing. She turned to run, but the hallway was gone. The house had shifted, the walls closing in around her. The last thing she saw before the world went dark was her reflection stepping out of the mirror, its grin widening. Claire woke in her bed, drenched in sweat. Her heart pounded as she sat up, her eyes darting around the room. Everything looked normal. Her laptop on the desk, the pile of laundry on the chair, the clock on her nightstand reading 7:15 a.m. It was just a dream, she told herself, but the memory of the glowing house felt too vivid, too real. She got out of bed and walked to the window, hesitating before pulling back the blinds. The old house stood silent and dark, just as it always had. But something was different. Her reflection in the window didn't move. Claire stared at the window, her breath catching in her throat. Her reflection stood perfectly still, its eyes locked onto hers. For a fleeting moment, she thought she was imagining it, that her exhausted mind was playing tricks on her. Then it moved. The reflection tilted its head, its lips curling into a slow, unsettling grin. Claire stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table behind her. The blinds fluttered shut, cutting off the sight, but her heart continued to hammer in her chest. What is happening? She spent the rest of the day in a haze, going about her routine as though on autopilot. The encounter with her reflection played on repeat in her mind, each memory of its eerie grin sending a shiver down her spine. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe it had been a lingering dream, or maybe she was overtired. But deep down, she knew something was wrong. That evening, Claire avoided the window entirely. She kept the blinds shut, turned on every light in the house, and settled onto the couch with her laptop. She needed answers, and if her neighbors wouldn't give her the full story, she'd look elsewhere. Her search led her to a local forum dedicated to urban legends and paranormal activity. Unsurprisingly, there were several threads about the old house. Thread title: The Glowing House on Maple Street. What's the deal? User 1. The house has been there for decades. Nobody knows who built it, and no one stays there for long. People say it's cursed. User 2. My cousin looked at the glow once. She started acting weird after that. Said she saw things in mirrors that weren't supposed to be there. Eventually, she stopped talking to us. We never found out what happened to her. User 3. It's not the house itself. It's what lives inside. They say if you look at the glow, it sees you too. The comments made her stomach churn. She closed the laptop and tried to push the thoughts away, but they lingered like a bad taste. That night, Claire's sleep was fitful. She dreamed of mirrors, hundreds of them, each reflecting distorted versions of herself. In one, she was smiling too wide, her teeth sharp like a predator's. In another, her eyes were black pits. She woke with a start, the sound of humming faintly audible in the distance. The digital clock on her nightstand read 2:03 a.m. Her heart sank. She didn't want to look, but the pull was irresistible. She crept to the window and peeked through the edge of the blinds. The house glowed brighter than ever, its light spilling onto the street like liquid gold. Shadows moved within the windows, their shapes indistinct but unmistakably human. And then she saw it, her reflection, standing in the yard. It wasn't in the window or the glass pane of her house. It was outside, staring back at her from the overgrown lawn of the glowing house. Her knees buckled, and she dropped to the floor, clutching her chest as panic took hold. When she dared to peek out again, the figure was gone. The next morning, Claire called her best friend, Emma. "I think I'm losing my mind," Claire said, pacing her living room. "What happened?" Emma's voice was calm, but there was concern beneath it. Claire hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "There's this house across the street. It glows at night. Everyone says not to look at it, but I did. And now," she trailed off, feeling foolish. "And now what?" Claire took a deep breath. "And now I think it's messing with me. I saw my reflection outside. It's like it's not me." Emma was silent for a moment. "Claire, are you sure you're not just stressed? Moving is a big deal. And if you've been hearing creepy stories, it could be your mind playing tricks on you." "I thought so too," Claire said, her voice trembling. "But this feels real. Too real. Do you want me to come over?" Emma offered. Claire hesitated. She didn't want to drag Emma into this mess, but she also didn't want to be alone. "Yeah, please." Emma arrived that afternoon, bringing a much-needed sense of normalcy. She was tall and confident, with a no-nonsense attitude that made Claire feel grounded. They spent the evening together, chatting and watching movies. Claire felt the tension in her chest start to ease, but as the hours ticked by, she couldn't shake the growing sense of dread. At 1:50 a.m., Claire turned to Emma. "Do you believe in ghosts?" Emma shrugged. "I'm open to the idea." "Why?" Claire hesitated. "I think there's something in that house, and I think it's watching me." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" Claire explained everything. The glow, the reflection, the dreams. Emma listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Claire finished, Emma stood and walked to the window. "Don't!" Claire shouted, but Emma was already pulling back the blinds. The old house glowed like a beacon, its light pulsating in rhythm with the faint humming sound that filled the air. Emma stared at it for a long moment before stepping back. "Well," she said, her voice tight, "that's definitely not normal." At exactly 2:05 a.m., the power went out. The house plunged into darkness, the glow from the old house now the only source of light. Claire grabbed her phone, its flashlight casting a feeble beam across the room. "Stay close," she whispered to Emma, her voice trembling. The humming grew louder, resonating through the walls. The air grew colder, and the faint scent of damp earth filled the room. And then, from the corner of her eye, Claire saw movement. She turned the flashlight toward the mirror hanging in the hallway. Her reflection was there, but it didn't mimic her movements. Instead, it grinned and raised a hand, beckoning her forward. Claire froze, her pulse thundering in her ears. "Do you see that?" she whispered. Emma turned, her breath hitching. "What the hell is that?" The reflection in the mirror stepped forward, pressing its hands against the glass as if trying to break through. The humming grew deafening, and the room seemed to warp, the walls bending inward. Claire grabbed Emma's arm. "We have to get out of here." They ran to the front door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were the same, their glass cold and unyielding. Trapped, they turned to face the mirror. The reflection was gone. And then, from behind them, a voice whispered, "Don't look too closely, Claire. You might not like what you see." Claire and Emma froze, the voice echoing in the darkened house. It was soft and low, yet impossibly clear, as though spoken directly into their minds. "Who's there?" Emma demanded, her voice trembling. The only reply was a faint chuckle, its tone dripping with malice. The air grew colder, the faint smell of damp earth intensifying until it was almost suffocating. Shadows shifted unnaturally in the dim glow cast by Claire's flashlight, stretching and writhing like living things. "Claire, what do we do?" Emma whispered. Claire's mind raced, her instincts torn between fight and flight. "We need to get out of here." There has to be a way. They moved cautiously through the house, the flashlight beam darting across the walls. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on them, making every step feel like wading through thick mud. The mirror in the hallway loomed behind them, its surface dark and still. Claire avoided looking at it directly, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something watched them from within. They reached the back door and tried the handle. It rattled uselessly, refusing to budge. "Damn it," Emma hissed, kicking the door in frustration. The chuckle came again, louder this time. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You're not trapped," the voice said, almost teasing. "You just haven't found the way out." Claire spun around, shining the flashlight toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing there, only empty air and shadows. "What do you want from us?" she shouted. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the faint hum that had been present since the glow grew louder, its rhythm syncopated and unnerving. Emma grabbed Claire's arm. "This isn't normal. None of this is. What's happening to your house?" Claire shook her head, unable to answer. Her thoughts were a jumbled mess of fear and confusion. As they turned back toward the living room, the mirror in the hallway began to glow. Its surface shimmered like liquid, reflecting a pale light that seemed to pulse in time with the humming. "What the hell is that?" Emma asked, stepping back. Claire's stomach churned. "It's the same light as the house." The glow intensified, and a shape began to emerge in the mirror. Claire's heart stopped as she recognized the figure. It was her. But the reflection wasn't a perfect match. Its eyes were too bright, its movements too fluid. It smiled at her, the expression unnatural and cruel. "Hello, Claire," the reflection said, its voice silky and mocking. "You should have listened to the warnings." Claire's legs felt like jelly, but she forced herself to speak. "What do you want?" The reflection tilted its head. "It's not about what I want. It's about what you've already given." Emma stepped forward, her fists clenched. "Leave her alone." The reflection's eyes flicked to Emma, its smile widening. "Ah, the brave friend. So noble. So naive." Emma's face paled, but she held her ground. "We're leaving, and you're not stopping us." The reflection laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. "You don't understand. She's already in. There's no leaving now." The humming grew louder, the vibrations shaking the floor beneath their feet. Claire felt a sharp pain in her head, as though something was trying to pry into her thoughts. Images flashed through her mind, visions of the glowing house, of shadows moving within its walls, of her reflection stepping out of the mirror. She saw herself standing in the old house's yard, staring at the glowing windows as the shadows reached for her. Her knees buckled, and she fell to the floor, clutching her head. "Claire!" Emma shouted, kneeling beside her. "What's happening?" Claire could barely hear her over the roar in her ears. The voice from the mirror spoke again, this time directly in her mind. "You've looked too long, Claire. Now you belong to us." When Claire opened her eyes, she was no longer in her house. She stood in a long, dimly lit corridor lined with mirrors. The air was thick and heavy, and the faint hum reverberated through the walls. "Where am I?" she whispered. Her voice echoed strangely, as though the corridor itself was alive. She turned to look behind her, but there was no door, no sign of where she had come from. The mirrors on either side of her reflected countless versions of herself, each one slightly different. Some were subtle, her hair parted on the opposite side, her shirt a different color. Others were grotesque, her face twisted into a sneer, her eyes hollow and black. "You're in the in-between," the voice from the mirror said, though there was no reflection to accompany it now. Claire turned frantically, searching for the source. "What do you mean? Let me out!" The voice laughed, the sound echoing endlessly. "You looked into the glow, Claire. You invited us in. This is your new reality." Claire's breaths came in short gasps. She banged on one of the mirrors, but it didn't budge. Instead, her reflection smirked at her, its expression mocking. Back in Claire's house, Emma stared in horror as Claire's body lay motionless on the floor. Her friend's eyes were open but vacant, staring unblinking at the glowing mirror. "Claire?" Emma shook her, but there was no response. The humming in the room grew louder, and Emma turned to see her own reflection staring back at her from the mirror. It smiled, its eyes filled with malice. "She's gone," the reflection said. "And you're next." Emma grabbed the nearest object, a heavy bookend, and hurled it at the mirror. The glass shattered, the glowing light dissipating with a final, piercing hum. But when she turned back to Claire, her friend was gone. The house was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. Emma stood alone, her reflection nowhere to be seen. She ran to the front door, relieved to find it unlocked. As she stepped outside, the old house across the street loomed in the darkness, its glow faint but steady. For the first time, Emma understood the warnings. Claire wandered the endless corridors of the in-between, her mind a fractured puzzle. The mirrors whispered to her, their voices taunting and cruel. "You'll never leave," they said. "You're one of us now." But Claire refused to give up. She knew there had to be a way out, a way back to her life. She just had to find it before the in-between consumed her completely. Emma stood on Claire's porch, the cold night air biting at her skin. Across the street, the old house pulsed faintly, its glow weak but steady, as if it were waiting for something or someone. She clutched her phone tightly, staring at the cursed structure. Claire was gone, taken by whatever nightmare the house contained. Emma had broken the mirror, yet it hadn't brought her friend back. "I'm coming for you, Claire," Emma whispered to herself, determination hardening her voice. Emma crossed the street cautiously, the faint hum growing louder with each step. The glow enveloped her, painting the world in a sickly gold hue. The air felt heavier, almost electric, and the earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse in rhythm with the light. The house loomed before her, its windows like empty eyes staring into her soul. The door creaked open slowly, inviting her in. Emma hesitated for a brief moment, then stepped inside. The interior of the house was nothing like she'd expected. It was vast, much larger than the exterior suggested, with ceilings that seemed to stretch endlessly upward. The walls were covered in intricate patterns that shifted and pulsed like living things. The hum was louder here, resonating in her chest and making her teeth ache. "Claire?" Emma called, her voice trembling. Her words echoed back to her, distorted and warped. She gripped her phone like a lifeline, its flashlight barely piercing the golden haze that filled the house. As she moved deeper inside, the walls seemed to close in around her, twisting and stretching like something alive. Doors appeared and disappeared, leading to hallways that branched in impossible directions. Emma stopped in front of a large, ornate mirror. Its surface was dark and opaque, but she could feel something watching her from within. "Claire, are you in there?" she whispered, her fingers brushing the cold glass. The mirror rippled like water, and a face appeared. It was Claire, but her expression was one of despair. "Emma?" Claire's voice was faint, as if coming from far away. "You shouldn't be here." "I had to come," Emma said, her eyes filling with tears. "I couldn't just leave you." Claire shook her head. "It's too late. The house, it doesn't let go. It's alive, Emma. It feeds on us." Emma's grip tightened on the phone. "I'm not leaving without you." Claire's reflection flickered, her image replaced by a shadowy figure with burning eyes. The thing grinned at Emma, its teeth impossibly sharp. "She's ours now," it said, its voice a guttural growl. "And so are you." The mirror shattered suddenly, the shards flying outward in a burst of golden light. Emma shielded her face, the hum now deafening. When she looked again, the hallway had changed. The walls were lined with mirrors, each reflecting twisted versions of herself. Some laughed cruelly, others screamed in silent agony. The floor beneath her feet shifted, becoming soft and uneven, like flesh. Emma staggered forward, her breathing ragged. "Claire!" she shouted, her voice echoing endlessly. A door appeared at the end of the hallway, its edges glowing faintly. Without hesitation, Emma ran toward it, her footsteps squelching against the unnatural floor. The door led to a massive room, its walls covered in pulsing veins of golden light. In the center stood Claire, her body suspended in midair by tendrils of shadow. Her eyes were closed, her face pale and lifeless. "Claire!" Emma screamed, running toward her friend. The shadows hissed, recoiling slightly as Emma approached. She grabbed Claire's arm, the coldness of her skin sending a shock through her. "Wake up, Claire," Emma pleaded, shaking her. "Please." Claire's eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, recognition flickered in them. "Emma," she whispered weakly. The shadows tightened their grip, dragging Claire further upward. Emma held on, refusing to let go. "You're not taking her," Emma shouted, her voice breaking. The golden light in the room intensified, and the shadows screamed, their forms writhing in pain. Suddenly, Emma felt a pull, as if something were trying to drag her into the light. She fought against it, her grip on Claire tightening. The shadows surged toward her, their forms twisting into monstrous shapes. "No!" Emma screamed, her determination burning brighter than her fear. She reached in her pocket and pulled out a small, silver cross, a gift from her grandmother years ago. She pressed it against the nearest shadow, and it recoiled with a deafening shriek. The room trembled, the golden light flickering. "Hold on, Claire," Emma said, her voice firm. "We're getting out of here." The walls began to collapse, the house's structure warping and folding in on itself. Emma pulled Claire free from the tendrils, dragging her toward a faint light that had appeared in the distance. The shadows chased them, their guttural screams echoing through the collapsing space. Emma ran with everything she had, clutching Claire tightly. The light grew brighter, consuming everything around them. Emma and Claire woke up on the sidewalk outside the house, the cool night air a stark contrast to the oppressive heat inside. The old house was gone. In its place was an empty lot, overgrown with weeds. Claire groaned, sitting up slowly. Her eyes met Emma's, filled with gratitude and exhaustion. "You came for me," she said, her voice hoarse. "Of course I did," Emma replied, tears streaming down her face. "I wasn't going to let you go." They embraced, the weight of the nightmare finally lifting. In the weeks that followed, Claire and Emma moved far away from Maple Street, leaving the horrors of the glowing house behind. But some nights, Claire still dreamed of the in-between, of corridors lined with mirrors and shadows that whispered her name. And in those moments, she wondered if the house was truly gone, or if it was waiting for someone else to look too closely.